Episode 13, 4 on War, Kids Edition.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Today will be the start to a new intermittent series called 4 on War. I'll be going over 4 books on war for each episode in the series, and I'd like to kick this one off with 4 kids' books on the subject that I highly recommend. I can attest that these books are kid-tested and anarchist parent approved. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. And since our last recording, we have not received any new ratings or reviews or patrons on Patreon. So if you like what we're doing, please consider leaving us ratings and reviews. That'll help us reach more people through iTunes and some of the other podcatchers. And think about supporting us through Patreon. If you'd like to, visit our support tab on anarchochristian.com. It'll take you to our Patreon page where you'll see options for one-time or monthly donations to support the show. And 2 more things before I get started. PorcFest is coming up. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you there. Again, I'm going to have the Q&A on Sunday morning, but we'll be there a few days before as well. Hit me up on the Whova app or through Twitter or Facebook. A lot of you already have, and I'm looking forward to meeting you. And one last thing, we do have t-shirts and hoodies on sale now. They are through Amazon. So I'll have links on Facebook and Twitter, and if you just go to Amazon, you can search Anarcho-Christian. It should take you right to it. We have a few different designs, and they've already shown to be very popular, and I have a few myself. I'm happy with the quality, and if you want to throw us a couple of bucks, hit up the Amazon link on the website, or just go through your Amazon app and search Anarcho-Christian and check out the shirts. All right, on with the episode. The other day, 2 significant things happened that inspired this episode. First, my family and I, we saw some enlistment commercials on TV. We were in a waiting room, and they had a TV going, and we saw those really typical enlistment commercials. I think it was for the Marines or the Navy, and it had slow-mo helicopters and beach landings and just really cool guns and the stuff, I think it had, the hard rock music and, just one of those things that really is done well to inspire people to join the service. And second, there was a really great post in our Facebook group about kids' books, and there were a ton of great recommendations. And of course, the nature of the group, many of the popular recommendations tended to be both on faith, war, liberty, and economics. So I thought I'd take a little time to give some of my recommendations on a very narrow part of the topic, war. And it's kind of inspired me to maybe do a few more of these, depending on how this one goes over, on some of the other books and some of the other topics that I mentioned earlier. So it probably doesn't seem likely that there would be a lot of options for kids' war books, but there are. And here's the thing. There are quite a few that will appeal to parents that don't mind presenting the topic to their kids, but also don't want to hand their kids pro-war propaganda, which I've seen plenty of too. I pre-read the books that I give my kids, and I've picked up several books that are history and war, and they were just either really weak, historically speaking, didn't offer a lot of information or correct information, or they were basically pro-war propaganda for kids. They really pushed the civil religion, the apotheosis of Washington, or the Christ-like figure of Abraham Lincoln, freeing the entire world. So the books I want to spotlight today, they're not pro-war propaganda pieces, but present a different take. And some are more overt than others, but I think that you'll enjoy all of them. I think your kids will enjoy all of them. And you may have heard of some of them already, but I think that there's a few here that you may not be aware of. So let's get started. And don't worry about writing anything down, because I'll have the links to all the books in the show notes. So if you're driving, just keep your hands on the wheel. All right, so first up, The Butter Battle Book by Dr. Suess. Now, everyone loves Dr. Suess. I don't think I've met anyone who doesn't. He is a part of all of our childhoods, and there's the usual books. You think of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas and Cat in the Hat, but I think that a lot of people might be unaware of some of the war-related stuff that he's done. Now, he did draw pro-war propaganda art in World War II. There's a ton of that documented online. I can put a link in the show notes for that if you're not aware of it. And, it is very similar to a lot of the stuff that you see from the propaganda art and posters from World War II. There's things that today wouldn't fly as far as stereotypes of other cultures. But this book, The Butter Battle Book, stands out in a different way. It was written in 1984, and it clearly addresses the Cold War and what an arms race looks like. It combines other stories of conflict like the Sneetches with a different take from what you've seen already with this propaganda art. So the story follows a feud between the Ukes and the Zooks. They've been at war with each other because one side likes to butter their bread on the top, and the other side likes to butter their bread on the bottom. And it's silly. It's typical Suessian silliness, showing a division between two different sides. And really, I find it a great example of how ridiculous our hate for the other side can be sometimes. But in the story, there is a wall between the sides, between the Ukes and the Zooks. Also in the artwork, you'll see that there's a few knocks against the classic World War II propaganda art. And I wonder if Suess, when he was drawing that, if he maybe felt a little bit of remembrance of what he had contributed to propaganda art. But after an incident at the wall, the Ukes decide to beef up their military presence with cooler uniforms and a bigger weapon, which of course is met in kind by the Zooks. So this goes back and forth with more shows of nationalism and bigger weapons until we see the development of a super tiny, destroy everything, radiating little ball. So both sides meet on the wall, both holding the same very destructive weapon, and it ends in a very Suessian standoff where you're unsure who's going to drop the bomb first and destroy everything. There was also a cartoon made of it in 1989, and I really recommend it too because it stays very, very close to the book. It's not a very long cartoon, but it's actually the first thing that turned us on to the story. My son saw the cartoon, and he told me, he said, "Dad, you got to see this. This is about war." And so I watched it, and I was amazed because, like maybe many of yourselves, I wasn't aware of this book. I wasn't aware of this sort of story from Dr. Seuss. So, again, I really recommend this book. It is just great. It has your ridiculous drawings from Dr. Seuss. It's not like one of those projects that maybe people will do where they'll get really wrapped up into the message and kind of lose their usual tone or lose their original style that you already liked them for. It's really a great book and a great cartoon. So, The Butter Battle Book by Dr. Seuss. All right, next up is Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales, Treaties, Trenches, Mud, and Blood by Nathan Hale. So, if you're not familiar with Nathan Hale or the Hazardous Tales, this is a series that we stumbled on by accident while we were visiting the Alamo. And he has one book dedicated to the Alamo, and they're small hardback graphic novel comic book style books. And I was just blown away by this Alamo book, and did a little bit of research in the book once we got home, and he has a whole series of books that really showcase big events in history, and usually having to do with war, as most history books are. It honestly is one of the most exciting things that, in history. But this one that I'd like to showcase is Treaties, Trenches, Mud, and Blood. And it's on World War I. And, it starts out like the rest of the books, where we are following stories from Nathan Hale. Now, Nathan Hale, the author, shares the name with the famous spy Nathan Hale from the American Revolution. And he's made jokes about that in the book, kind of breaking the fourth wall type stuff, I think. And each book is the story of this historical event told by Nathan Hale, the revolutionary spy, basically the moment before he's to be hung, which is what happened to him in history. But in the books, we have this kind of moment of suspended history where the hangman, a provost marshal, and Nathan Hale are hanging out on the gallows, and Nathan Hale is giving them stories about history that'll happen in the future for them, but it's things that are history for us. It's a great concept, very unique and very fun. As the hangman is hilarious, and the provost marshal, he's really into war and romance stories, and the hangman is really into the into war and death and destruction, but it's silly. And we have Nathan Hale, the character, the spy, that is explaining these stories, and a lot of times he does have a really good point to make in the stories, and about the bravery of certain people in history. He has one on called the Underground Abductor, and it's about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, and this is just a really great series. So this one starts out with Nathan Hale, the spy, explaining World War I. And so World War I, of course, we know, but maybe our kids don't. We know how large of a conflict this was, and how this was, near the beginning of the 20th century. And some of the facts that he brought into a kid's story about World War I was absolutely mind-blowing. He brought in everything that you could think of surrounding war and surrounding World War I. Really, the first time we'd seen such a large-scale war. So a couple of things that really stood out to me that, made me stop reading sometimes and just take it all in, was he explains the leading up to a war, and this war in particular. And the way that he explains it, he uses a lot of symbolism, and you see these armies marching through these ramps leading up to war, and each ramp is supported by a pillar of imperialism, another one that has alliances written on it, another one that says nationalism, and another that says militarism. And this is something that a lot of people stay away from, especially with kids' books. You're not allowed to speak of the negative consequences or the negative ideologies leading up to a war. And so again, just seeing in this book that he's using words like imperialism and alliances and nationalism and militarism was just mind-blowing for me. And, it started a lot of good conversations between myself and my children about these things, about these topics and these words that, I'm sure a lot of kids really aren't exposed to. And he does a really good job in the book of showing these alliances and how some of them are just ridiculous, how somebody has to help somebody else, or how they're dragged into the war. We see in this book the growth of war over the years. Nathan Hale, the author, and the spy character, he does a really good job of explaining the loss of life by giving the death tolls. He portrays war as a drawing of Ares, the god of war. And as the war goes on, almost in chapter breakups for each year, we see Ares become bigger and crazier looking as he consumes more and more lives that are dropped into this fiery cauldron. And it sounds a little graphic, but in my opinion it isn't. But I would just recommend that, if that's something that you are concerned about, check out the book. Sometimes you can check them, you can see the insides online, or if you have any questions, hit me up on a message. and I'll definitely go into more detail with you on that. But getting back to it, this book it even shows the growth of weapons that warfare experienced at this time, going from smaller weapons and just the growth of somewhat like what we saw with the arms race and the Butter Battle book, where bigger weapons and more militarism, the uniforms became grander. This book just really blew me away. I already liked the series prior to this. I liked the way that some of these events are handled in the Hazardous Tales series, but this one here it still stands out to me as just an impressive book to introduce to your children on the horrors of war and the complete loss and devastation and the carnage that comes from war, and specifically what happened in World War One. Again, just explaining the millions of lives that are lost and truly the interesting developments that took place during this war. It doesn't glorify war. And it even ends with the characters wondering, what was it all for? So, honestly, I love this book. I love this series. And the book really is like a kid's primer for Dan Carlin's Hardcore History series, A Blueprint for Armageddon, which is an excellent podcast. I recommend all of you check that out as well. All right, book 3 is The Tuttle Twins, The Golden Rule by Connor Boyack. So you guys might already be familiar with Connor Boyack and the Tuttle Twins. He's very popular. The series is very popular within our world. But if you're not, and if you're not familiar with this book specifically, I'm going to get into some of it. Connor runs Utah's Libertas Institute, which also republishes classic liberty books like The Law, Civil Disobedience, and some of Connor's own. I own Feardom as well. They're great books that he puts out with Libertas Institute. Great quality books. They look great. He just does a fantastic job. And so Libertas Institute also puts out the Tuttle Twins series. And these books are geared for kids. And they're usually about 50 or 60 pages and illustrated. They look great. They follow a family, specifically these two kids, Ethan and Emily. And they follow them through these adventures that are usually always based on economics and politics, and based on books that are already popular that would appeal to adults. So we have The Miraculous Pencil, that's based on iPencil, The Law, based on Bastiat's The Law, and a few others, The Road to Serfdom, just some really great books. And my son's personal favorite is The Creature from Jekyll Island. Of course, it has this cool, scary theme to it of this monster that's taking everyone's money away through inflation, and it's a really good book. But today I wanted to go over the Golden Rule. It really fits with our theme of our war theme or anti-war theme for our kids' books. And this one is based on Ron Paul's book, A Foreign Policy of Freedom. And it's kind of funny because Ron Paul was booed by Republicans in 2012 during a presidential debate for suggesting that the golden rule that all Christians should support should be our country's policy. And that really is what this book is about. And we see in the story the twins, Ethan and Emily. They go to summer camp and end up separated into two teams for the camp's competitions of canoeing and archery and other camp activities. Now, the two teams begin to engage in sabotage against each other, and eventually it gets to a dangerous point that makes the camp counselors have to step in. And so Chief Ron then explains to the feuding teams important concepts like acting on fear, blowback. It also explains the golden rule of treating your neighbor the way you want to be treated, and even explains the non-aggression principle. So I highly recommend this book. There's not really any other book that I've seen that is going to explain the concept of blowback and the non-aggression principle and really tie it all together with, something that the audience here is interested in, and that's the golden rule. So I can't recommend this enough, really. Each Tuttle Twins book features a page on the back about the person and their particular book that inspired that story. And so this one has a little comment from Ron Paul at the end of his book about the foreign policy of freedom, which is a compilation of a bunch of Ron Paul's speeches about foreign policy. So I highly recommend, both those books really, and the whole series. All right, so fourth on our list, last on our list, but definitely not least, is The Pushcart War by Gene Merill. And before I get into the book, I just want to say there's also an audiobook, which I've also listened to, and it's one of the best narrations that I've ever heard in an audiobook, where the reader, he uses several different stereotypical New York accents for the different characters in the story, and it's phenomenal. So that's another option there too. If you're not, going to get the paperback book, there is an audiobook option, and it's fantastic. So now back to The Pushcart War. This book was written in 1964, and where it really shines is it shows how wars start and how they're conducted, but on a very small scale. It's very funny, and it takes place in New York City in a time where they're starting to see a lot of congestion in the streets between the big trucks, delivery trucks, and the pushcart vendors. It talks about all sorts of different pushcart vendors, flower salesmen, food sales, and then your delivery trucks, and how they keep either the trucks are hitting the push carts or yelling at the push carts for being in the way, and kind of documenting this growth in the area and how the congestion was just really built up, and it kind of gets to this boiling point between these two groups. And there is very funny dialogue and events as the pushcart vendors decide to fight back against the truck drivers after an incident called the Daffodil Massacre, where one of the trucks destroys a flower cart. And so the story follows members of the war against the trucks and the pushcarts, and shows some interesting insight into money and power backing certain sides for their own vested interest. We see donor money purchasing weapons, laws being passed and repealed with extreme bias, and the effects on and from newspapers and police enforcement. It's written as if it were a real event in history, and there are a few humorous things that help push this idea that it might have really happened, but I don't want to spoil them for you because it was something that I later researched and had some head scratching that I did enjoy trying to figure out, and it made me enjoy the book even more. And so my son read it right at 10 years old. I'm pretty sure that it's a big book, so it looks a little daunting. The copy that I have is right around a little over 200 pages. And so there are some illustrations. They're black and white. It's a little daunting, I think, when I was surprised at the size of the book. But I first heard about it from I believe it was a historian or a professor on the Tom Woods show. And she was mentioning different books that she just recommended in general, I think. And one that she brought up was the Pushcart War, and mentioned that it was a kid's book. And it's even advertised as such. And it has a kid's drawing, kind of looks like a crayon drawing on the cover. And if you see it on Amazon, and it just doesn't seem like it'd be that big of a book. So when I got it in, I was a little surprised. But anyways, I really enjoyed it. The dialogue between the pushcart vendors and how they try to pull off this war against the truck drivers and flattening their tires, and the way that the truck drivers then have to react, and they try to figure out what's going on. And then when they realize that there's this war going on, then you see some of the things I already mentioned as far as the police and the newspapers and the politicians and the big money kind of all coming in support of their individual sides. And again, a humorous book. I can't recommend it enough. My son absolutely loved it, and I know your kids will like it too. So that really concludes our books. Let me know on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. Let me know what you think about these books. Have you read any of these before? If you pick them up after hearing this episode, let me know what you thought. Let me know what you think about some of the other books in the series, the Tuttle twins or the Nathan Hale series. And if you like this series of 4 on War, let me know that as well. We'll continue it with a couple of different editions. This being the kids edition, we'll maybe move on to some other books on specific war events, or I don't know. We'll see where it takes us. But if you're interested in grabbing a copy of any of the books I mentioned, I'll have an Amazon link in the show notes. And if you use the Anarcho-Christian link, we'll receive a small commission, but at no additional charge to you. So until next time, grace and peace. No king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com. Like us on Facebook.com/anarchochristian and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.